So hi.
Hi.
So would you start by just introducing yourself a little bit and telling us about what it is that you do?
Yeah, I'm glad to join you here and have this discussion. My name is Jennifer Harvey, and I am a psychologist here in Switzerland. And I founded a company called Intergifted, an organization about 7 years ago, and that's dedicated to helping gifted adults, so intellectually gifted adults, to thrive in life. The common conception is that when you're a gifted kid, then you just grow out of it and you become a regular adult and you just kind of catch up to your peers or whatever. And that's actually not the case, because once you're gifted, generally always gifted. And so as a gifted kid who grew up to be a gifted adult and who needed special attention for that reason, I realized that there were a lot of other people like me that were looking for services, looking for support, looking for self-understanding in spaces that didn't understand giftedness, didn't understand the particular challenges of gifted people. And I thought, oh, well, if I know how to do this now that I'm figuring it out for myself, I guess I could do it for other people. So our organization is a big community around the world, and we have coaches and assessors, and we do courses, and I do trainings for therapists and coaches in gifted specific psychology. So that's my main work that I've been doing for the last 7 years. And then a few years ago, I realized I can't just focus on giftedness as if it existed in a bubble and not in the real world where all of these challenging things are happening. And the climate crisis was, for me, one of the climate and biodiversity crises were really, like, I could not look away, and I couldn't just keep working every day as, like on psychology, as if that wasn't part of our psychology and wasn't part of, our needs for thriving. So I just started a project called I Heart Earth, and it's been kind of this climate psychology project, trying to understand climate psychology, trying to understand how we can reconnect with the earth, reconnect with the climate, reconnect with the parts of ourselves that can really be interdependent, consciously interdependent with the world that we're in, and doing, some climate leadership and education on these topics. So, and that's of course how I found you. Lucky me. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously the first question I'm going to ask you is, what is giftedness? And could you explain it to someone who's watching and hasn't heard of this concept before?
Okay, so giftedness, the simplest definition that I usually use is that it's higher than average complexity of thought. A lot of times that feels really intense to people. So if you have been in conversation with somebody who keeps asking that next question out, and that next one out, and that next one out, and you're thinking, why don't we just talk about the issue at hand? Why are they asking all these other questions? You may be talking to a gifted person. There's a high degree of curiosity, very complex curiosity, a high need for intellectual stimulation. And like I said, that can often look very intense to the outside. It may feel very normal from the inside, and a lot of gifted people are confused because they assume that everybody else feels that much curiosity and that much intensity inside. But then, when they realize that they're different, they say, oh, that explains so much, but I could have never believed it before, And then the way that I work with it is there's the intellectual giftedness, and then there's other areas where you could also be gifted, but not necessarily. So sometimes we hear things like musically gifted, or talented in sports or whatever. So there's like different ways that you could express exceptional talent or exceptional ability, but that you could do those things without being intellectually gifted, or intellectually more highly gifted than, or highly intelligent than the norm. So I kind of work with a holistic model where I look at gifted creativity, gifted emotions, like emotionally gifted people, physical giftedness, sensual giftedness, and existential giftedness. And so when I'm like doing assessments for people and training, I'm always talking about the full picture of a gifted person's profile. And along with that, there's all kinds of other intersectionalities as well. So you can have twice exceptionalities like autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, something that is usually a contextual disability, like together with the high ability. So kind of makes it a bit more complex and challenging to live with, but also more interesting. And then there's other things like where you're raised, what your culture believes about giftedness, what your family believes about giftedness, if your educational experience had anything to do with giftedness or not. And also like personal and collective traumas and things that can make us hide parts of ourselves, make us mask. A lot of women, gifted women, have struggled, for example, to show their full intelligence because sometimes that doesn't feel safe. And so we play the sweet one when we actually have very complex thoughts, you know? So there's a whole range of things that come along with that basic definition. It's like, so the simple version is complex, higher than average complexity of mind. And then there's all that rest out there.
What is existential giftedness? I really wanted to know.
Favorite question of many people. So what's really fascinating is somebody who is existentially gifted often can't grasp that other people wouldn't be, because that takes up so much of their mind space. So questions of values, morals, why we're here, what's beyond what we see, what are the unifying factors of existence, is there life out there, you know, all of these kinds of themes and questions. There's a high level of complexity, an uncommonly high level of complexity. It's not just interest, because anybody can be, gifted or not, anybody can be interested in these themes and also can be highly achieving in these themes. But high achieving doesn't necessarily mean that you have that complex level of intense curiosity and drive to learn more and more and more and more and go beyond and beyond and beyond with your questions. So yeah, a lot of times when I'm working with gifted people who are existentially gifted, they're like, yeah, but doesn't everybody think like that? And I'm like, no.
Yeah, I mean, when I did this 6-week course about existential coaching, again, I'm like, I ask these questions anyway. Like, how could people not be contemplating, I don't know, death, or, you know, whether or not we live in a simulation, or free will, fate, you know, all these things. Yeah. So
yeah, it's funny. I'll sometimes do an assessment with somebody, and so they give me a lot of information, and then I analyze the data, and then we have a conversation about it. And I will see nothing, not one comment that suggests that they think about existential issues at all. And maybe they're profoundly gifted intellectually, but just the existential just isn't. It's not their direction of focus, and they're not thinking about it. And so typically in an assessment, I'll ask, so, you know, questions of life and death, what's the meaning of life, what's beyond, spiritual questions, these kinds of things. And sometimes, I mean, I'm being a bit, you know, simplistic for the sake of the illustration, but it's kind of funny because sometimes they'll say, you know, when you die, and that's it. And I don't really care about it any more than that. And then I think, okay, so you can really be, you know, you can really be profoundly gifted, but really not have that existential giftedness as part of your profile.
And obviously, we've also found that some people are very triggered by the word gifted, right? They immediately think this is some very snobby thing or very privileged thing. So what do you say to that?
Well, when I started in the field, I thought, oh, maybe I'm going to have to come up with another language around it, because, yeah, it does trigger people. And I get it. Gifted, it sounds quite, you know, like I think I'm somebody better than somebody else. And then I did a lot of theoretical work on it, and I just realized almost everything in the literature is about the word gifted. The research is about the word gifted. The other books that are written are mostly with the word gifted. And there are a few others out there who have come up with alternative names. But then the problem is you get that confusion around what is it really, if it's got all these different names. And some of them are like more metaphorical, and some of them are more like, you know, acronyms, and it gets quite kind of confusing. And in the end, you always, even if you use like the metaphorical or the acronym type descriptions, you still have to point back to the giftedness once, like the word gifted, once somebody needs to go looking into the research. So I thought, you know what, I think I'll just stick with it, and I'll just educate people as much as I can. I'll sort of make it part of my mission to educate people about what it is, and take that story of superiority, the fake story of superiority, out of it. But something that's been really challenging is that you know, sometimes gifted people want to think that that they themselves and their peers, their gifted peers, are like just because they're smarter, that they are also more correct, and that is some version of superiority, and so that they can kind of go around and brag about it, and that causes harm to every gifted person and non-gifted person alike, because that's actually not the point at all. Like, gifted people are really good at certain niche things, and gifted people are really good at certain things, and it's not an apples to apples situation. So you can't say like, oh yeah, oranges are so much better than apples. I mean, what criteria are you judging on? They just serve a different purpose, and they have different nutrients and so on. So yeah, educating about that was part of my mission, and especially talking about it in the gifted adult field. Because if you talk about it for gifted kids, there's this excuse like, well, we need to get them good education, the right gifted education, or we need to get them special services for tutoring, or we need to like advance them a grade or something. But when you're an adult, what can, there's no excuse, unless it's like, I care about myself and I just want to learn who I am. But that paired with this idea of giftedness can sound really like, if you're already extra smart, then you already have everything you need. And so why are you taking our extra attention? Shouldn't you be giving that extra to somebody else? And that's a lot of like the trauma that can happen to a gifted person, because they do have different needs, and they are oftentimes feeling very different than the people around them. And then if everybody's going, well, oh, good for you, you're smarter, then we can just leave you alone. There's a kind of, benign neglect that can happen. Or sometimes malignant neglect, but we'll say most of the time it's probably benign.
Yeah, so you mentioned gifted trauma, and I know that was something you talk about a lot, right, in your work. So yeah, so what is traumatic about being a gifted adult in the world that we live in? I have my own guesses as to the answer, but
yeah, well, a lot of the gifted trauma happens for kids growing up, just not being recognized, having their giftedness sometimes exploited, or like I said, ignored. So there can be kind of an active like abuse of the person, or it can be, like I said, benign neglect. And it can be kind of contextual, like the situation just doesn't recognize me or something, or it can be much more personal and pointed. And if a person has that in childhood, then it's likely that they're going to continue to feel trauma responses growing up and getting into adult life and getting jobs and doing their career and having a family or whatever, making friends. But if we look just at the adult giftedness and the trauma that can come about, it's like a lot of times people feel they're just trying to find their way. So for career, for example, they'll take a job, they're trying their best, but they're getting really bored, and nobody's understanding why they're bored, and people think they're being too demanding, and their boss thinks that they're going too fast and asks them to please just slow down, or please just focus on the task that I'm giving you or something. And that happens enough times in a row, and they can really feel like something's faulty with me. Something's wrong with me. Why can't I last at a job? Is it my personality? Is it my, this kind of thing? So that kind of thing can feel really traumatic. And then again, you can have these themes that I mentioned from childhood. You can have them play out again in adulthood, where a person's in a relationship, and so contextually, the relationship or the family situation is like ignoring the gifted side, or insulting it, or so there can be some bullying around it, or like I said, exploitation. Oh, I've heard it in my life at different times. Jen can take care of it. Jen will know, which is, I mean, I like helping and I like knowing sometimes, but sometimes I also need to be able to count on other people to take the time to know. And when you're really mentally fast, a lot of times you do know a lot of things before, because you just learn very fast. And that can make people default to relying on you. And that can be a huge burden. And for I'll say again, especially for women who have been hiding that part of themselves, they can end up being in this kind of quiet caretaker role, even though they have a lot to say and they have a lot they have a lot of their own, personal stuff to give, but it ends up being, that energy ends up being kind of put back into taking care of other people's issues and problems. So yeah, those are some of the ways that it can play out in adult life. And as that relates to our current world, you can see how, I mean, the current world's really weird. And so if somebody's ignoring a gifted person that's saying, I have solutions, I'd like to help, what can I do? And people are saying, slow down, why do you have to question everything? Like, I've seen a lot of activists, a lot of people that are really concerned with the climate happen to be gifted people. It makes sense because they're thinking ahead, they're noticing the trends, they're learning about the stuff. It makes total sense. But then when you have all of the online bullies, you have people in the family life saying, why are you becoming vegan? You're such an elitist. And, you know, this kind of stuff that can go on. It's maybe it's not, you know, not every comment is traumatic or something, but a persistent insults and just ongoing thing can really end up feeling traumatic for somebody, especially somebody who's saying, I'm trying to use my capacities for doing good and for being a good person on this, you know, on this planet, and leaving a good legacy and a habitable planet for other people, and then getting attacked for that. So there's a lot of those kinds of dynamics that, yeah, that can go on.
I found one thing that I'd mentioned from my own experiences, when you assume that everyone else is thinking about things in as complex a way as you are, and then you realize they're really not. So, you know, you kind of feel, oh, I haven't understood this because everyone seems so, I don't know, impressed by this model or this theory. I must not get it. Maybe I'm stupid. And then, you know, it's more like later on when you go, oh, wait, no, it's just that.
Yeah. Okay. This is so common. Yeah, through school, I mean, I remember this all the time thinking, did I miss something? Because is this taking everybody a really long time? And so there must be something I didn't get, you know? And still that happens. And I hear it all the time from the people that I work with. It's a huge, huge challenge. And it can make you loop around and slow down and end up really confused about your reality. There's a bit, you know, I mean, you and I both know the word gaslighting. Not everybody probably does, but anybody who's interested in psychology these days, trauma, we'll hear about the word gaslighting, but this idea of sort of being told that the reality is different than the way you're experiencing the reality. And this can be, to me, this is a form of like implicit, you know, gaslighting. Nobody's like telling me that my perception is wrong, but I'm just getting the sense that my perception is wrong, just because the way people around me are behaving. And such, you know, in those cases, it's such a mismatch for what's going on for me that I'm like, so a lot of my work is about explaining that mismatch to people and going like ungaslighting people and saying, no, what you were experiencing was real for yourself. It's just that here's how the other people were experiencing it.
Yeah.
And for somebody who's not trained in it, you would not know. Before I was trained in it, I just didn't get it. And even though I went to gifted school, nobody told me what that would mean for my adult life. Like I'd forgotten about it by the time, you know, by the time I was out on my own. I was like, okay, I'm just a regular person. And then it was later on that I rediscovered it and was like, oh, I need to like really learn what this is and learn what the whole range of cognition is.
Because the education system doesn't prepare people for the real world at the best of times, right? But I think people who are really good straight A students, in a way, are let down even more by the education system in a way, right? Because you're taught to acquire and reproduce knowledge in a really specific way that isn't really how most jobs work, and it doesn't really teach you how you have to, I don't know, bullshit your way into a job with certain stock phrases and words and that kind of thing. So
yeah, there's research done about like the IQ range of people who really get on well in the regular, you know, business world and the sort of regular leadership world, and it's something like up to one. I don't want to misquote myself. Hang on. I think it's up to about 135. That it's like, yeah, you can kind of fit in quite well. You'll be definitely a high achiever. If you're a high achieving type, because high achieving and giftedness is not necessarily the same thing. So if you're gifted and you're a high achieving type, you'll do really well. Whereas the higher you go on the scale, the harder it gets, because your questions and your curiosities and the complexities going just beyond even the high level way the information is being presented to you. So even though somebody who is say like exceptionally gifted could do really well in school, yeah, that's not going to be preparing them well for having their, having their IQ or having their level of intelligence out in the regular world. So no, it's not preparing people, particularly well. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a few gifted academies or something out there that do some social emotional development and, education around the giftedness, but I have yet to meet those people. And I've been working in this field for a decade, so but they could exist. Don't get me wrong, I don't know everybody, but
yeah. Well, if they're out there watching,
yes, please contact me. I'd like to learn about your work.
So let's bring this into the climate crisis, because that's what we were talking about. And by the time this comes out, we'll have also done a workshop bringing together the work that reconnects and giftedness. So yeah, do you feel that, okay, as we've said, right, gifted people are more likely to be connecting the dots and looking forward and going, okay, here are some very bad predictions about the world. What do we do about them? How does that affect me? Whereas, it seems like the majority of people are able to somehow compartmentalize that information and ignore it. So yeah, I guess I want to ask, what is the crossover with giftedness and the climate crisis, and kind of what do we do with that as well, right? Because it can be very frustrating or even traumatic to just watch things unfold when you realize that the people with the power and influence are maybe not gifted people, or maybe they are, but they're not doing it in an empathic, compassionate way. They might be gifted, right, and using that power to, I don't know, increase their own power, for example.
It's a huge issue, because just because you're complex doesn't mean you have good intentions. And also, everybody's, culturally raised in a different culture, raised in a different mindset, and certain mindsets lead to certain ideas of what reality is and what the solutions to the problems of how they define reality is. So yeah, you can have people, we have some, profoundly gifted people in positions of great power right now, who are really, really believe in techno-solutionism, for example, and like that's what they're pushing. And you have people who are also profoundly gifted and contributing terribly, terribly to the problems and the climate crisis. And then you have other people who are like more empathic, so gifted, but more empathic and thinking about it from a human lens or an existential lens, and maybe raised in a different culture, or maybe in the same culture but experienced it differently or cared differently, and so see it from a very different lens. So more from like a degrowth or humanistic or something, some kind of other lens, eco-psychology lens, something like that. And so it's across the board. And then you have people who don't want to pay attention to it. And so they will find ways to have that just not be in front of them. So they're putting their complexity into whatever they're putting it into, and it's not the climate crisis. And I have people in my community and people I work with sometimes tell me, like, I just have to ignore the news because I don't like the way it makes me feel. And so they're not they're kind of putting their complexity, their mental complexity, toward avoiding it. They find very complex ways to avoid it, So it's kind of interesting that, because when I kind of had a bias when I first got into the field. I thought, like I said, kind of at the beginning, I thought, oh, well, everybody will care about life and death and life on Earth and the meaning of life and so on, because that's what I care. I mean, that's how my complexity shows up. And seeing that really wasn't the case. And when I started doing the research and realizing that there were a lot of people who did really terrible crimes as, highly gifted people, then I thought, oh, okay, so this isn't like, okay, gifted's gonna look like that when you think of solutions. It's like everybody defines the problem their own way, like they apply their complexity to however, their worldview is. So it's not homogeneous at all. And I expected it to be 1,000 times more homogeneous. So something that's kind of bothered me in, recent years, this kind of culture of the genius, like worshiping public geniuses who are going to solve all of the things. I think it's really problematic because this is one person, and yes, they might be really bright, but we need a whole community of people working together, gifted and non-gifted minds alike, and all the different points of view to come together and find like a common way forward. Because I think it's quite scary when all the eggs get into one basket that come from, like, I mean, that tree comes from a certain culture, a certain way of looking at things, and yeah, the complexity will be applied and major things will be accomplished, but are they the ones that serve the whole?
Yeah, well, that's the thing for me is, if you do apply your ability to see complexity to the climate crisis, then of course you start to see it's a lot more than just talking about, one enemy like carbon and one solution, which is some fix. And there are so many different, things that affect each other, systems thinking, as again, I found out was a thing that wasn't just obvious.
Not everybody is a systems thinker.
No. And there are people I see out there in my network applying a kind of heavy, I guess, IQ lens to it, but then without also having the EQ. Maybe it does always risk going down into, I guess, a very reductionist model that ends up with a techno fix. And for me, I try to bring in psychology, as a big angle. It's like, what will people actually adopt if we try to change policy, or how will people deal with heat waves, right? Because even the physical impact of a heat wave have a massive impact on mental health, not just the knowledge of impeding doom or something. So so there's a lot going on, and I already see the time flying.
Yes, indeed, there's so much to discuss.
There is. It's always the way. So maybe what I want to ask you finally is, if people are watching this thinking, oh, maybe I am gifted. You said before, we need people who are gifted to step up as leaders. So do you want to say more about that?
Yes, if you think that you could be gifted, if you already know a lot about it, well, good, join us in leadership in the climate space. If you hear some of what I'm talking about and what Gwyneth is asking about, you can go to the website of my organization, which is intergifted.com. And Gwyneth, I think you'll put it in the show notes. And on the menu, you'll find what is giftedness page. And that's a good start to exploring these 6 areas of intelligence that I talk about in my model, and looking at some of the particular life experiences of gifted people and what it feels like and what that shows up like in the relationships and career and so on. But so once you kind of find out that you are, if you already know, or if you find out that you are gifted, then it's really about taking the time to understand your particular form of giftedness. Because, and this is I think this is the power, Gwyneth, of your work and mine in terms of the climate psychology stuff, is that it's not just, I mean, there's not this like thing where somebody goes, oh, okay, I'm gifted, that means I'm extra smart, so I plug into this perfectly matched place to make my contribution. I mean, we're all just creating it as we go. Like, we're in an unprecedented situation. Psychologically, we're having to just figure out emerging themes as it's going. And it's really important. I think it's like a basic skill to really understand your cognition, understand what your strengths are, understand what your weaknesses are, understand where you need to partner with other people because they're stronger than you, and what and how you need to be communicating given how your mind works and who you need to be talking with. So it's like really not just, I mean, I kind of had wanted to like just go out there with a sign and start screaming or something. And then I was like, okay, my mind works in a pretty strange way compared to the norm. So where does this mind contribute in its own unique way? And so I think for everybody that's listening that identifies with that, I mean, this applies to anybody because everybody has a different mixture of these intelligences. I mean, you don't have to be gifted to have these intelligences. If a thing is alive, it has some version of most of these intelligences, like even non-human life. But the idea is, gifted or not, you figure out what your profile is and figure out what your strengths are, so that you can really be consciously engaging and building whatever profile you like, building up on your profile, so that you can contribute in the way that's most unique to you, and where we need you. Like, Gwyneth, if you and I were, instead of talking about climate psychology, if we were out doing different kinds of activism stuff, we could. I mean, I physically have the body to go have the thing and scream, but it's good that somebody who enjoys that more and is more suited, like more extroverted than I am, for example, is doing that, and that I'm working on the climate psychology, because this is what I love to explore, and this is where my unique complexity kind of shines and can light the fire for other people as well. So that's my little motivational speech for everybody.
It's very nice. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and yeah, I will see you soon.
Thanks for inviting me to the discussion, and to all the listeners, hello, and come check out Giftedness if you find it relevant at all for yourself or for people you know who sound like that. They will appreciate it very much if you learn about them.
Absolutely, and I'll link to your website, and also maybe the interview where you interviewed me. That might be interesting also for people.
Yeah, that would be great, and maybe to the I Heart Earth project. Yeah. That would be great. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Thank
you. Okay, bye everybody.